With the rendering going for the beauty pass, or main pass in full color, we can think about other render passes. What I usually add on is an ambient occlusion pass. What is ambient occlusion, you may ask? Well, light bounces around a scene, and at some point that light is ambient, from nowhere in particular, merely everywhere. Adjacent objects block that bounce light, giving us corner darkness. Sometimes, some people may also call these proximity shadows. What it does, ambient occlusion, is ground everything. Right now it looks like the lamps especially are floating next to the ceiling, and the wall and the ceiling and the wall and the floor, or the columns and the floor, although they're shadowing, don't quite meet exactly. The echo, although they're shadowed, are floating on the floor a little bit. So we'll run an ambient occlusion pass and composite it together with the beauty pass to make everything sit down. Here's how this works. We can run an ambient occlusion pass as a material override in the rendering. The first thing I'll do is disconnect my exposure shader from my camera. I'll select the camera, and in the shape node I'll scroll down to the mental ray rollout. In mental ray I'll right-click on lens shader and choose break connection. Now, we didn't delete the shader, we simply broke the connection. If we need to reconnect it, we can type its name right in here, or connect it in the hypershade. But for ambient occlusion, we want to take off the exposure. I'll also go into the render settings, and under features, turn off final gather. We don't need it for the render. The nice thing with ambient occlusion is you can run it quickly. You need cameras and geometry. No lights, no materials, no textures, just cameras and geometry. Now for the occlusion. I'll press Ctrl A to go to the channel box. In the render layers, there's my master layer. I'll right-click on the master layer and choose Overrides, create new material override, and I'll pick a surface shader. What this does is, as it says, overrides all the materials in the scene without deleting them, with whatever material I've chosen. I'll press Ctrl A to go to the attributes. A surface shader simply returns a color. If I put in white, everything is white. It doesn't light or shade necessarily. I'll click on the texture for the out color of my surface shader and go down to Mental Ray Textures. In Mental Ray Textures, I'll choose the MIB Amb Occlusion, or Mental Ray Ambient Occlusion shader. This is a great place to use IPR to tune the look. I'll pull up my IPR and size it down to 50%. When I start a rendering initially, I get black, but at least it's a quick render. And there's also dots on everything. Here's what's going on. Ambient occlusion depends highly on the distance of objects. That's why modeling in real-world scale is so important. My max distance in the ambient occlusion is in scene units. How far apart are objects before they stop casting darkness on each other? With a max distance of 0, everybody casts darkness. The floor and the ceiling cast darkness on each other. When I put the max distance up at, say, 90, there's my render. This is ambient occlusion, where adjacent objects are blocking the ambient light in the scene. How far apart they stop is an artistic choice. I'm going to let mine run fairly high, 90 inches, so I get good grounding darkness at the bottom of my columns and on my characters. The spread determines whether that occlusion clusters in the corners or spreads into that zone. I'll lower the spread here so you can see the difference. With a lower spread, the darkness clusters more in the corner. We can really see it on the column here. With an even lower spread, I get tight lines of occlusion grounding my objects. This again is an artistic choice. I'm going to leave mine fairly high so I get good grounding shading. Finally, we've got bright and dark values. The bright is when an object is returning no occlusion, or is totally unshaded. The dark color determines when an object is fully occluded, what color does it return. If you'd like, you can bring this up from black to avoid adding a heaviness to your rendering. I'm going to bring mine into just a little bit of charcoal. So instead of going in all black and getting heavy corners, I get lighter imagery. I can also attune this in post adjusting the shadow tones in color correction and composite. Finally, I've got samples. A sample rate of 16 is fairly coarse, giving me dots in my image. I'll bring this up to 64, and I should get a smoother occlusion. It's looking pretty good. I'll go through and check and make sure there's no obvious issues or darkness in places it shouldn't be, and I'm set to batch render it. For occlusion, I'll go in my render settings and take the B off the file name and put in AO. When I render a frame, it should be fairly quick. Unless there's an excessive amount of geometry or your samples are way too high, you should see your occlusion renders go quite fast. I've rendered the ambient occlusion pass, and I've got good grounding darkness. Here's what it looks like in composite over the beauty pass. In composite, I've put a beauty pass into the background of a blend and comp node. In the blend and comp node, the foreground is the ambient occlusion. In blend and comp, I've set the occlusion to multiply. And here's the difference. With the occlusion on, the ceiling pops out, all the detail is there, the characters are grounded, everything has some darkness to it. Here's the beauty pass on its own, and occlusion. Now it is dark, but we can adjust that fairly easily here if we need. That's something we'll reserve for compositing. But running an ambient occlusion pass will ground all the renderings, settle everything down, and pop out all the detail. Then we can adjust the color so it's not quite so heavy, and get images that sit well. And more importantly, characters that stand firmly on the ground.